In school, the millionaire's son mocked and bullied me, but what happened next shocked everyone and left him apologizing with a trembling voice. I always hated the smell of cafeterias. That weird mix of reheated pizza, cheap knockoff perfumes, and industrial-strength disinfectant that screamed American high school louder than any yearbook ever could. But there I was, Elena Parker, sitting alone at the far corner table of Westlake High's cafeteria, trying my hardest to become one with the scenery. It had been exactly 3 weeks since Dad and I rolled into that fancy Connecticut suburb in his ancient Ford pickup, the one with the rust spots he called character marks. 3 weeks since we left behind our tiny apartment in Pittsburgh after Mom died. 3 weeks in that wealthy town where Audis and BMWs filled the student parking lot, and I was the only one wearing thrift store sweaters that probably went out of style when Kurt Cobain was still alive. Dad kept saying we were lucky he got that new job. I didn't ask what he actually did because his standard answer was always the same tired line. It's boring stuff, kiddo. Just boring adult stuff that pays the bills. Whatever it was enough to get us a small rental house in a zip code where most people had swimming pools and vacation homes. The cheerleaders' 2 tables over were harmonizing to I Want That Way, like they were auditioning for America's Got Talent. I almost admired their confidence. Almost. The football guys were juggling French fries and competing to see who could catch more in their mouth. Normal teenage stuff that felt like watching a foreign film without subtitles when you're the new girl. I took a bite of my peanut butter sandwich, homemade, because $5 for a school lunch was highway robbery according to Dad, and tried to focus on the dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye I was hiding behind. Holden Caulfield got me in a way those Westlake kids never would. Well, would you look at that backpack? Is that vintage Walmart or premium Dollar General? The voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a knife, and suddenly the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. I didn't need to look up to know it was Lucas Fletcher, quarterback, prom king frontrunner, and some guy who apparently owned half the commercial real estate in town. I gripped my book tighter and kept my eyes down, a strategy that had worked approximately 0 times so far. Hey, I'm talking to you, Goodwill girl. Lucas leaned across my table, his Letterman jacket reeking of expensive cologne that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. His perfectly white teeth flashed in what most people might have mistaken for a friendly smile, but I recognized as a grin of a predator who'd found easy prey. The table fell silent, and I could feel dozens of eyes turning our way. This was Lucas's favorite part, the audience. What was the point of humiliating someone if not everyone could see it? I finally looked up, meeting his blue eyes that somehow managed to be both stunning and completely cold at the same time. They reminded me of those Arctic lakes that look beautiful in National Geographic, but would freeze you to death in minutes. It's actually from Target, I muttered, immediately hating how defensive I sounded. My backpack, a plain navy blue one with a coffee stain on one strap, suddenly felt like a signed confession of poverty. Lucas picked it up between 2 fingers like it might be contaminated. Wow, Target? Living large, huh? Does it come with its own food stamps? The cafeteria erupted in laughter. Not everyone. I noticed a few uncomfortable faces, eyes that darted away when I looked at them, but enough that it felt like the whole world was in on the joke. A joke where I was a punchline. Lucas's sidekick, a beefy guy whose name I thought was Tyler, high-fived him while a couple of the cheerleaders giggled behind manicure hands. One of them, blonde, perfect, wearing what I was pretty sure were real diamond earrings, whispered something to Lucas that made him laugh even harder. I wanted to say something clever. Something that would make them all realize I was a human being with feelings and not just some poverty prop for their entertainment. But my throat felt like I'd swallowed sand, and all my words got stuck somewhere between my brain and my mouth. Instead, I grabbed my backpack from Lucas's grasp, stuffed my book inside, and stood up, abandoning the rest of my lunch. I could feel hot tears threatening behind my eyes, but I'd be damned if I gave them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Ah, is Goodwill girl leaving already? But we were just getting to know each other. Lucas called after me as I walked away, trying to keep my steps measured and calm, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. As I pushed through the cafeteria doors, I heard someone say, "Just leave her alone, man." But it was too quiet, too late, and followed by more laughter anyway. The hallway outside offered no real escape. It was just another gauntlet of designer clothes, suspicious stares, and whispers that stopped just as I passed by. Every high school had its ecosystem, its food chain, and in just 3 weeks, I'd learned exactly where I ranked at Westlake High, somewhere between the gum stuck under the desks and the mystery meat they served on Tuesdays. I locked myself in a bathroom stall, finally letting a few tears escape as I texted Dad. Having a great day. Learning lots. The same lie I'd been telling since I started there. What was the point of telling him the truth? He was already working longer hours than he did in Pittsburgh, coming home with those heavy bags under his eyes that appeared after Mom's funeral and never really went away. There's this quote I read once by Ralph Waldo Emerson that said something like, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Easy for old Ralph to say. He never had to survive American high school as the new poor kid. The afternoon classes blurred together. In English, we were discussing The Great Gatsby, and I almost laughed out loud when Mrs. Peterson talked about the American dream. From my seat in the back corner, I watched Lucas whispering to his perfect girlfriend, occasionally glancing back at me with that shark smile. He had a 4.0 GPA on top of everything else, which seemed cosmically unfair. But I'd seen him when his dad called, the way his shoulders tensed up, how the swagger disappeared. His father expected perfection. Being the king of Westlake High wasn't a choice for Lucas. It was a requirement. Not that it excused anything. But sometimes I wondered if bullies were just people who had all their choices taken away. So they took away others' choices to feel powerful again. After school, I waited in the library until the parking lot cleared out. I'd learned this trick already. If I left right when the bell rang, there was too much chance of running into Lucas and his court. By the time I finally walked to Dad's pickup, the lot was almost empty except for a few teachers' cars and some students at after-school activities. Mom would have known how to handle this situation. She grew up poor too, but somehow always carried herself like she was worth $1 million. It's not about what you wear, she used to tell me. It's about how you wear it. I missed her so much it felt like a physical weight in my chest, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe sometimes. At home, Dad was still at work. Our rental house was small, but neat, the kind of place real estate agents would call cozy instead of tiny. I heated up some leftover pasta and took it to my room, where at least I could pretend the outside world didn't exist for a few hours. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror on my closet door. Same brown hair that never quite did what I wanted it to. Same hazel eyes that Mom always said were my best feature. Same second-hand clothes that might as well have had a target painted on them at Westlake High. Maybe if I just stay quiet enough, they'll forget about me, I whispered to my reflection. Maybe if I'm invisible enough, Lucas will find someone else to torment. But even as I thought it, something flickered in my chest, a tiny spark that felt dangerously close to anger. Or maybe it was just survival instinct. Either way, it was the first time since Mom died that I felt anything stronger than grief or fear. In every school across America, there's a Lucas Fletcher, someone who thinks they're royalty because they can throw a ball or because their parents have money. And in every school, there are the invisible kids like me, just trying to make it through each day without becoming a casualty. As I started my homework, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that somehow I'd wandered onto a stage in the middle of the play where everyone else knew their lines but me. I was clutching my backpack, my apparently offensive, non-designer backpack, like it was some kind of shield. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Going to be late tonight, kiddo. Don't wait up." I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "No problem. See you tomorrow." If I stayed invisible, maybe all this would pass. But deep down, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Mom's kept whispering that invisibility wasn't a superpower. It was surrender. And something told me that no matter how quiet I tried to be, Lucas Fletcher had already decided I was worth noticing. I just wished he'd noticed the right things. I thought staying invisible was a solid plan. Keep my head down, blend into the background, just make it through the year. But what I didn't understand yet was that Lucas Fletcher was like one of those heat-seeking missiles from action movies. He could detect weakness from a mile away, and invisibility just made me a more intriguing target. The morning after the cafeteria incident, I deliberately arrived early to English class. Mrs. Peterson's room before the bell was my temporary sanctuary. She was usually buried in her coffee and morning crossword, completely oblivious to anything happening around her, perfect for someone trying to disappear. I slid into my seat at the back and pulled out my journal. Not a fancy leather-bound diary, just a composition notebook I'd covered with band stickers and doodles. Inside were my thoughts, bad poetry, and letters to Mom that I knew she'd never read. Writing to her made me feel like she wasn't completely gone. The classroom filled up slowly. The usual suspects drifted in. The kids who color-coordinated their notebooks with their outfits, the ones who hadn't done the reading and were frantically skimming Cliff's Notes, and the half-asleep zombies clutching energy drinks like life support. Nobody paid me any attention, which was exactly how I wanted it, until Lucas walked in. He had this way of entering a room like he owned it. Chin up, shoulders back, that practice smile that made teachers think he was charming and students think he was God's gift to Westlake High. His girlfriend Amber trailed behind him, tapping away at her phone with those impossibly long nails that made me wonder how she functioned in daily life. I quickly shoved my journal into my desk, but I wasn't fast enough. Lucas's eyes locked with mine for a split second, and I saw that flash of recognition. The predator spotting prey. He whispered something to Amber that made her giggle and cover her mouth with perfectly manicured fingers. Mrs. Peterson finally looked up from her crossword. All right, people, settle down. Today we're continuing our discussion of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Please open your books to Act 3. The familiar rustling of pages filled the room as Mrs. Peterson wrote quotes on the whiteboard, the smell of dry erase markers mixing with someone's overpowering body spray. I kept my head down, focusing on the worn pages of my second-hand copy with previous owner's notes scribbled in margins. So, who can tell me about the theme of fate versus free will in this act? Mrs. Peterson asked, scanning the room for a victim. No one volunteered. Elena, any thoughts? Of course. The one time I wanted to be invisible. I mumbled something about how Romeo blames fate for killing Tybalt, when it was really his own choices, and Mrs. Peterson nodded enthusiastically, like I just delivered a TED Talk worthy of standing ovation. Excellent analysis. Romeo's I am fortune's fool is his way of... I never heard the rest of her sentence because, in that moment, I felt something brush against my desk. Before I could react, Lucas had reached over and snatched my journal right out from under my textbook. The move was so smooth that Mrs. Peterson didn't even notice, too caught up in her love affair with Shakespeare. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster that had just crested the biggest hill. That journal had everything. My grief over Mom, my fears about fitting in, even some embarrassingly raw poetry about feeling like I was drowning in a sea of designer labels and fake smiles. Lucas flipped it open in his lap, just low enough that Mrs. Peterson couldn't see from the front of the room. His eyes widened slightly as he scanned the pages, and a slow smile spread across his face. Not his usual practice grin, but something sharper, more dangerous. Lucas, I whispered urgently, give it back. He ignored me completely, nudging Amber and pointing to something I had written. They both stifled laughs. I felt my face burning. Seriously, that's private. Elena, Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the room. Is there something you'd like to share with class? Before I could answer, Lucas raised his hand, my journal dangling from his other hand. Actually, Mrs. Peterson, I found some really interesting writing I think the class would appreciate. Elena's been holding out on us. She's quite the poet. The blood drained from my face. This couldn't be happening. Mrs. Peterson, completely missing the situation, smiled. Oh, how wonderful. Would you like to share Elena? I'll read it. Lucas offered before I could refuse. He cleared his throat dramatically and began reading from my journal in a mockingly emotional voice. Dear Mom, it's been 87 days since you left. Dad pretends he's okay, but I heard him crying in the shower again this morning. I'm wearing your old sweater, even though it's too big, because it still smells like you sometimes. The room went dead silent. Some kids looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few were already smirking. Amber had her phone out, holding it low like she was texting, But I realized with horror that she was recording. Something inside me snapped. It was one thing to mock my clothes or my backpack, but these were my words to my dead mother. This was sacred ground. I lunged across the aisle and grabbed the journal from Lucas's hands with such force that he actually looked startled. "That's mine," I said, my voice steadier and louder than I expected. "The only thing that belongs to you is that nasty tongue in your mouth. Maybe try keeping it there for once." The classroom went even quieter, if that was possible. I could hear the wall clock ticking. Lucas's face registered genuine shock for a split second before morphing back into amused contempt. "Elena!" Mrs. Peterson finally caught up to what was happening. "We do not speak to other students that way, regardless of the provocation. Lucas, return Elena's personal property immediately." Too late. The damage was done. "It was just a joke," Lucas said, hands up in mock surrender. "Can't you take a joke, good little girl?" Mrs. Peterson frowned. "Lucas, that's enough. Elena, please see me after class." The rest of the period crawled by in humiliating slow motion. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, hear the occasional whisper. When the bell finally rang, I stayed glued to my seat while everyone else filed out. Lucas paused at the door, that shark smile back in place. But there was something different in his eyes, like I'd surprised him, and he didn't like surprises. As the room emptied, a girl I barely knew, Sarah something, who always sat in the back corner, walked past my desk and whispered, "That was badass." Then she was gone before I could respond. Mrs. Peterson's idea of addressing the situation was to remind me that teenagers say hurtful things sometimes, and suggest I try not to let it bother me. She meant well, I guess, but her advice fell somewhere between useless and infuriating. "It was just a joke, Elena," she said, echoing Lucas's words. "Try not to dramatize the situation." I wanted to ask if she'd feel the same if someone had read her private thoughts about a dead loved one to a room full of people, but I just nodded and promised to handle it better next time, as if I was a problem. I thought the worst was over, but that was before lunch period. I was standing in line, trying to decide if the mystery meat casserole was actually edible when I felt a presence behind me. Before I could turn around, cold liquid cascaded over my head, soaking my hair, face, and the front of my shirt. Gasps and laughter erupted around me as milk dripped from my chin onto my shoes. I turned to see Lucas holding an empty milk carton, his expression a perfect mask of fake concern. "Oops," he said loudly. My hand slipped. "Looks like you could use some calcium. Good little girl. You're looking a little pale." I stood there, frozen in shock, milk mingling with tears I refused to let fall. Through the crowd of laughing students, I saw phones pointed at me. At least 3 people were recording my humiliation. In that moment, I understood something about the modern version of bullying. It wasn't enough to hurt someone once. Now they wanted to capture forever, to make your worst moment shareable, likable, commentable. The lunch lady handed me some napkins with a sympathetic look, but didn't say anything. No teachers stepped in. No one helped. I cleaned myself up as best I could and spent the rest of the day in damp clothes that smelled increasingly sour as the hours passed. That night, Dad came home late again. He didn't notice my puffy eyes or the smell of spoiled milk still lingering in my hair despite a long shower. He was too exhausted, too wrapped up in his own struggles. I didn't blame him. Since Mom died, we'd both been treading water, just trying not to drown. I retreated to my room and pulled out my journal again, staring at the pages Lucas had violated with his eyes and voice. I wanted to tear them out, burn them, start fresh. But that felt like letting him win somehow, like allowing him to take Mom from me again. Instead, I started a new entry. "Dear Mom, today was the kind of day that makes me wonder if high school is actually just an elaborate social experiment designed by sadistic psychologists. If so, I think I'm in a control group that gets no help and all the trauma. Remember how you always told me that bullies are just insecure people who need to make others feel small so they can feel big? I used to think that was just something adults say to make kids feel better, like how you told me broccoli would give me superpowers. But today I saw something in Lucas's eyes when I stood up to him. This flash of surprise, maybe even respect. before he put his mask back on. It made me wonder if maybe you were right after all. What if he's just as scared as I am, just better at hiding it? Don't get me wrong. He's still an incredible jerk who deserves to step on Legos every day for the rest of his life. But maybe understanding him is the first step to surviving him. You also used to say that silence in the face of cruelty is the same as approval. Martin Luther King Jr. said something similar, that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. I've been so focused on being invisible, but maybe that's the problem. Maybe invisibility isn't protection. It's surrender. I miss you more than words can say. I wish you were here to tell me what to do, but maybe I already know. Maybe your voice in my head is enough. Love, always, your messy, milk-soaked, but slightly less invisible daughter, Elena. I close my journal and put on my headphones, cranking up Nirvana's Come As You Are until Kurt Cobain's voice drowned out my thoughts. The irony of the song title wasn't lost on me, coming as I was seemed to be exactly the problem at Westlake High. Through my window, I could see stars appearing in the night sky. They reminded me of something Dad said at Mom's funeral, that the light from stars takes years to reach us. So when we look at the night sky, we're actually looking at the past. Maybe somewhere out there, Mom could see me too, looking back through time. My phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged me in a post. With a sinking feeling, I opened it to find a milk video already circulating on Instagram. The comments were what you'd expect. Mostly laughing emojis and a few OMG savage responses. But there were also a couple of not cool comments that gave me a flicker of hope that not everyone at Westlake was a complete monster. I shut off my phone and tossed it aside. There was a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt I'd found when researching a history project. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I'd always thought it sounded nice, but wasn't particularly realistic. After all, when someone pours milk on your head in front of 50 people with cameras, your consent seems pretty irrelevant. But lying there in the dark, something shifted in my thinking. Maybe Eleanor wasn't talking about the feeling in the moment, but what you do with it afterward. Maybe dignity isn't about never getting knocked down. It's about how you get back up. I thought about Sarah, the quiet girl who'd whispered badass after I stood up to Lucas. I thought about the few not cool comments on that horrible video. Small things, barely noticeable in the tsunami of cruelty, but they were there. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I fell asleep with Nirvana still blaring in my ears, and woke up with a strange sense of resolve. As I got dressed for school, I deliberately chose a sweater that Lucas had mocked last week, the oversized green one from Goodwill that he called homeless chic. I wore like armor. The milk incident would be waiting for me. The video would have spread. Things would likely get worse before they got better. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, I made a decision. Tomorrow will be worse, I told my reflection, but I'm done hiding. Because invisibility wasn't working anyway. And if I was going to be seen, I might as well be seen for who I really was. Messy, grieving, poor, but still standing. Maybe that was the real superpower all along. The next morning, I walked into school wearing my decision like armor. No more invisibility. No more hiding. I'd spent 16 years being Elena Parker, and if Westlake High couldn't handle that, it was their problem, not mine. At least that's what I told myself as I pushed through the front doors, my stomach in knots. Word about the milk incident had spread like wildfire. I could feel eyes following me down the hallway, hear the whispers that stopped when I got too close. The video had made its rounds. Over 200 views, according to the notification I'd reluctantly checked that morning. My humiliation had gone viral, at least by Westlake standards. I kept my chin up, clutching my notebook so tightly my knuckles turned white. The first 2 periods passed in a blur of sideways glances and stifled giggles. Each time the classroom door opened, I tensed, waiting for Lucas and whatever creative new torture he devised for the day. By 3rd period English with Mrs. Peterson, my brave facade was wearing thin. I slid into my seat, already dreading what was coming. Lucas had made it his mission to break me, and so far he was batting 1,000. The milk video was just the latest escalation in his campaign. I gripped my pencil so hard I could hear the wood creaking in protest. The seat next to mine, usually occupied by a quiet girl named Megan, who never spoke to me but at least didn't join in the torment, remained empty as the bell rang. Mrs. Peterson was arranging papers on her desk, oblivious as usual to the undercurrents in her classroom. Lucas sauntered in late, high-fiving a couple of football players as he made his way to his seat. His eyes found mine immediately, that predatory grin spreading across his face. He made a subtle drinking motion with his hand. Milk joke. Hilarious. Original. I dropped my gaze to my notebook, silently reciting the mantra I'd practiced in the mirror that morning. They can only hurt you if you let them. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. Before we continue with Romeo and Juliet, we have a guest speaker today who's going to talk to us about something very important. The classroom door opened, and for a moment, my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. My dad walked in. Not tired. Rumpled dad in his faded flannel, who left before dawn and came home after dark. This was someone else. He wore a crisp navy suit that I'd never seen before, his silver-flecked hair neatly combed, his posture straight and commanding. He looked like he'd walked straight out of Law and Order. The class fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like a physical presence in the room. Even Mrs. Peterson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Good morning," Dad said, his voice calm but carrying authority I'd never heard before. "My name is Thomas Parker. I'm the Assistant District Attorney for Fairfield County." The pencil I'd been strangling snapped in half. Assistant District Attorney? My dad? The guy who ate cereal for dinner and sometimes forgot to shave for days at a time? The same man who told me he had some boring office job? A ripple of whispers washed through the classroom as several students made the connection. I heard someone behind me mutter, "Parker, that's the new girl's last name," followed by another voice adding, "Wait, that's her dad?" Suddenly, all eyes were darting between him and me, confirming what some had already suspected from our shared last name. I felt like I'd slipped into an alternate reality where my father was suddenly important, powerful, someone who commanded attention when he walked into a room. Mrs. Peterson found her voice. "Mr. Parker will be speaking to us about a very serious issue affecting many schools across the country. Please give him your full attention." Dad nodded his thanks, then let his gaze sweep across the classroom, briefly pausing on me with a nearly imperceptible softening around his eyes before continuing. "I'm here today to talk about bullying," he began, and just like that, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Not just as a prosecutor, but as someone who cares deeply about young people and the environments they learn in. I risked a glance at Lucas. He was no longer lounging in his seat like he owned the place. His spine had straightened, and he was watching my father with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, wariness. Dad continued, his voice measured and professional. "Bullying isn't just a kids will be kids situation. In many cases, it constitutes harassment, intimidation, and in some instances, assault, all of which have legal consequences." Mrs. Peterson shifted uncomfortably at her desk. Several students were looking anywhere but at Lucas, who had started tapping his pen rapidly against his notebook. In Connecticut, schools have a legal obligation to address bullying when it's reported. Failure to do so can result in administrative reviews and potentially serious consequences for institutions that turn a blind eye. Dad's eyes briefly flickered to Mrs. Peterson, who suddenly became very interested in straightening papers on her desk. But beyond the legal framework, there's a human cost. Studies show that victims of sustained bullying suffer long-term psychological effects similar to PTSD. The silence of bystanders, of those who witness bullying and say nothing, perpetuates the problem. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I nearly gasped out loud. Those were the exact words I'd written in my journal the night before, the quote I'd been thinking about when I decided to stop being invisible. How did Dad know? Had he read my journal too? Recent incidents at this school had been brought to my attention. Dad continued, and now his voice had an edge that made everyone sit up straighter, including videos being circulated of students being humiliated. I want to be very clear. Recording someone without their consent and distributing that recording can have serious legal consequences. Lucas had stopped tapping his pen. His face had drained of color. The district attorney's office takes these matters seriously. While I'm not here to single anyone out today, I am here to inform you that an investigation into systemic bullying at Westlake High will be conducted with full cooperation from the school board. Mrs. Peterson made a small, strangled sound. Principal Garrett, who must have been summoned at some point, appeared in the doorway looking like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Dad's voice remained calm, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. Those who have participated in bullying behavior will be given an opportunity to make amends and change course. Those who continue such behavior will face appropriate consequences. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking, someone breathing too fast a few rows over, the squeak of Lucas's chair as he shifted uncomfortably. I felt a strange sensation bubbling up in my chest. Not quite happiness, maybe closer to vindication or relief. For so long, I'd felt powerless, like I was shouting into a void where no one could hear me. Now, suddenly, someone was listening. Someone with authority was saying the things I thought no adult would ever say. But along with that relief came a new fear. This wasn't how I wanted to win. Having my dad fight my battles for me felt like cheating somehow, like I'd given up on finding my own voice. Before I could process these conflicting emotions, something unexpected happened. I stood up. I hadn't planned it. My body seemed to move of its own accord, pushing back my chair and lifting me to my feet. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape, and my hands trembled, but I was standing. 26 pairs of eyes swiveled in my direction. Dad paused, surprise briefly crossing his face before he composed himself. "Yes, Elena?" For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd stand there mute, my mind blank, and everyone would laugh again. But then words came. Not perfect words, not Hollywood speech, but my words. "I don't want anyone's pity," I said, my voice shaky than I would have liked, but audible throughout the suddenly tomb-like classroom. What happened to me, what keeps happening, isn't just about me. It's about what kind of place we want this school to be, what kind of people we want to be. I risked a glance around the room. No one was laughing. Some looked uncomfortable, others guilty. A few, including Sarah from the back row, were watching me with something that might have been respect. I'm not asking anyone to be my friend. I'm just asking for basic respect. The same respect I'd give any of you. My eyes landed on Lucas, who was staring at his desk like it contained the secrets of the universe. He looked smaller somehow, deflated, like a balloon with all the air let out. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "I don't want revenge," I continued, surprised to find I actually meant it. "But I'm done being silent. I'm done pretending it's okay when it's not." I sat down, legs suddenly wobbly, adrenaline coursing through my body. I couldn't believe I'd just done that, spoken up in front of everyone, including Lucas and his followers. The old Elena would have melted into the floor, rather than draw attention to herself. Dad cleared his throat, and I could see in his eyes a mixture of surprise and unmistakable pride. "Thank you, Elena. That kind of courage is exactly what we need more of." He addressed the class again. "Justice isn't about revenge. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, true reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the pain, the hurt, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. But in the end, only an honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing. Today is that confrontation with reality for Westlake High." Principal Garrett stepped forward, his face a complex mix of emotions. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I assure you the administration takes these allegations very seriously, and we will cooperate fully with any investigation." Dad nodded curtly. "I'm glad to hear it. The school board will be receiving formal notification today, and we'll be conducting interviews with students regarding their experiences." His eyes swept the room. "I encourage anyone who has witnessed or experienced bullying to speak up. Your statements will be treated confidentially." As Dad and Principal Garrett left the room, Mrs. Peterson attempted to resume the lesson on Shakespeare, but it was a lost cause. The atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. No one was paying attention to Romeo and Juliet's tragic romance. They were too busy processing what had just happened. I kept my eyes on my textbook, feeling both victorious and terrified. Today had changed everything, but I had no idea if it was for better or worse. After class, a small miracle occurred. As I gathered my books, Sarah, the girl who'd whispered badass to me the day before, stopped by my desk. "That took guts," she said quietly. "What you did." I shrugged, not trusting myself to speak. For what it's worth, not everyone thought what happened to you was funny. Some of us just didn't know what to do about it. She glanced around nervously, then added, "I reported the milk video yesterday. Sent it to the principal. I don't know if that's how your dad found out, but yeah. Anyway, see you around." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring after her in shock. Lucas avoided me for the rest of the day, slinking to the hallways like a shadow of his former self. The usual taunts and whispers were noticeably absent. I caught several of his former entourage giving him a wide berth, as if his downfall might be contagious. By the time I climbed into Dad's pickup after school, my emotions had cycled through every possible variation. Relief, embarrassment, guilt, vindication, fear about tomorrow. They all swirled together into a confusing tornado. "So," I said as Dad pulled out of the parking lot, "Assistant District Attorney, huh? Were you ever going to mention that little career detail?" Dad had the grace to look sheepish. I know. I should have told you. It just, after your mom died, I wanted one part of our lives to feel normal, not defined by what I do or the cases I handle." "But how did you know?" "About Lucas, about the video. I never told you what was happening." Dad sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "You didn't have to, kiddo. I've seen that look before, on witnesses, on victims, that trying to disappear look. I was giving you space to tell me in your own time, but then..." He trailed off, and I filled in the gap. "Then what? What changed?" "One of the paralegals at the office has a son at Westlake. He showed her that milk video, not realizing you were my daughter. She came to me immediately, concerned about what she called a disturbing bullying incident. When I saw it was you..." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I should have asked more questions, pushed harder to find out how you were really doing at school. I'm sorry, Elena." I stared out the window, watching the manicured lawns of our affluent neighbors roll by. "It's not your fault. I didn't want to worry you. You've had enough to deal with since Mom..." "Hey," Dad's voice softened. "That's not how this works. It's my job to worry about you, not the other way around. We're a team, remember?" The lump in my throat made it hard to answer, so I just nodded. When we got home, I finally asked a question that had been burning in my mind all day. "Am I going to have to testify, or something? Make an official statement?" Dad shook his head. "Only if you want to. There's enough evidence with the video and other incidents that have been reported. This isn't a criminal case. Elena, it's an administrative review. The goal isn't to punish Lucas. It's to fix a broken system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Later that night, Dad knocked on my bedroom door with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Our tradition for serious conversations since I was little. He sat on the edge of my bed, looking more like my rumpled, tired dad again in his old t-shirt and sweats. "You surprised me today," he said, handing me a mug. "What you said in that classroom, that took real courage." I blew on my hot chocolate, watching the marshmallows swirl. I surprised myself. I didn't know I was going to do that until I was already standing. Dad smiled. "Sometimes the bravest things we do are the ones we don't plan. Your mom would have been so proud of you today." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so reminiscent of Mom that my chest ached. "You're stronger than you think. Elena." "Always have been." After he left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. In movies, the bullied kid who finally stands up for themselves gets instant validation, applause, newfound popularity, the collective respect of their peers. Real life was Messier. There had been no applause, no dramatic shift in the social hierarchy, just uncomfortable silence, shifting glances, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. I reached for my journal and wrote about the day, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I wrote about the shock of seeing Dad in his prosecutor mode, about my unexpected speech, about Sarah's quiet act of alliance. I wrote about Lucas's deflated demeanor and how strangely unsatisfying it felt to see him brought low. Most of all, I wrote about finding my voice, how terrifying and exhilarating it felt to finally say out loud the things I've been writing in private for weeks. Today I spoke up. I wrote in conclusion. I said words that people actually heard. But what happens tomorrow? Is one moment of bravery enough to change anything? Or did I just paint an even bigger target on my back? I closed my journal and turned off the light, but sleep remained elusive, for better or worse. I'd stepped out of shadows today. I'd made myself visible in a way that couldn't be undone. Today I spoke up. I whispered into the darkness. But what happens tomorrow? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But for the first time since arriving at Westlake High, I faced the uncertainty without the crushing weight of silence on my chest. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would meet it with my own voice. Westlake High transformed overnight. With Lucas suspended for a week and an official investigation looming, the school scrambled to prove they actually cared about bullying. Suddenly, teachers who'd mastered the art of looking the other way developed eagle vision for any conflict. Colorful anti-bullying posters materialized on every wall, as if clip-art slogans like "Be kind" could magically reform teenage behavior. The cafeteria felt weirdly quiet without Lucas orchestrating the social hierarchy. His loyal subjects looked lost, occasionally glancing my way with expressions ranging from resentment to nervous curiosity. Word had spread about potential legal consequences for sharing those humiliation videos, and several enthusiastic filmmakers were suddenly concerned about their college applications. I settled at my usual corner table, resigned to another lonely lunch, when Sarah, the girl who'd whispered badass after I stood up to Lucas, approached with her tray. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. The question nearly made me choke on my sandwich. An elaborate caste system of Westlake. Sarah wasn't royalty, but she definitely wasn't untouchable like me. She played field hockey, got decent grades, and had actual friends. Associating with me offered zero social benefits. Yet there she was, suddenly telling me about her cousin who'd been bullied at another school and her secret dream of writing young adult novels. Before lunch ended, she'd invited me to the literary magazine meeting that Thursday. As I watched her disappear into the chemistry lab, I wonder if I'd slipped into some alternate dimension where Elena Parker got invited to join things. The administrative damage control campaign continued all week. Mrs. Peterson, who dismissed Lucas's behavior as just jokes, pulled me aside after English. "Elena, I want to apologize for not taking the situation more seriously," she said, nervously adjusting her glasses. "We're implementing a new anti-bullying program with teacher training and awareness posters throughout the school." I bit back the urge to ask if she really thought colorful posters would solve systemic problems. Instead, I thanked her and escaped before my cynicism could leak out. Amazing what the threat of an official investigation could accomplish. At home, Dad kept me updated on the official proceedings. Lucas's father, the real estate magnate, was surprisingly cooperative. Some people only understand consequences when they affect their bottom line. Dad explained over slightly burnt grilled cheese sandwiches. The Fletchers are worried about their community's standing and Lucas's college applications. Self-interest isn't the noblest motivation for change, but sometimes it's the most effective. I picked at my dinner, wondering what was happening in Lucas's world. Was his father yelling at him? Was he plotting revenge for when he returned? Or was he just possibly reflecting on his actions? What happens when he comes back? I asked, voice of my lingering fear. Probationary status. One more incident means expulsion, plus community service, mandatory counseling, and participation in the anti-bullying initiative, Dad explained. Either he'll hate you more, or this will be the wake-up call he needs. Either way, the power dynamic has changed. He knows there are consequences now. The most unexpected development was other students approaching me with their own Lucas stories. Jamie, a quiet sophomore from math class, confided how he'd been tormenting her about her weight since freshman year, leaving diet pamphlets in her locker and mooing when she walked by. I told my homeroom teacher once. She whispered, but she said I needed to develop thicker skin. Jamie wasn't alone. Over the next days, others shared similar experiences, not just with Lucas, but with his entire inner circle. It was like a dam had broken. People who'd suffered in silence for months or years suddenly had permission to speak. I wasn't special, just the most recent target who, through a series of coincidences, my father's position, the viral video, my unexpected courage, had become the catalyst for a long overdue reckoning. Thursday arrived, and with it, my first literary magazine meeting. I almost didn't go. The thought of entering a room where everyone shared a history that didn't include me was terrifying. But Sarah had texted a reminder, and something in me wanted to test this new reality. Mr. Grayson's classroom smelled of coffee and old books. About a dozen students sat arguing good-naturedly about Jack Kerouac while sipping terrible coffee from the ancient machine in the corner. Sarah waved me to an empty desk. "Guys, this is Elena." "Elena, this is everyone." No one made a big deal of my arrival, which was exactly what I needed. They continued their Kerouac debate, occasionally asking my opinion, as if I'd been part of the group forever. For the first time since arriving at Westlake, I felt something close to belonging. Not because I'd suddenly become popular, but because I was with people who care about the same things I did. Words, ideas, the power of a well-crafted sentence. When I shared a poem I'd written, hands shaking slightly as I read from my journal, the room fell silent before erupting in genuine appreciation. "That was really good," said the editor, a lanky boy with glasses. "We'd love to publish it in the next issue." Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. The school's anti-bullying campaign still felt superficial. Some of Lucas's friends still glared at me in the halls. But I had found something that was mine, my voice, my words, and a small group who valued them. As Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Our literary magazine group wasn't changing the world, but they had changed mine. I spotted a flyer about an upcoming school assembly on building a community of respect. They wanted student speakers to share their experiences. I stared at it long after the hallway cleared, thinking, maybe this is a chance to say more. The assembly arrived faster than expected. The auditorium buzzed with students excited to escape class, the forbidden scent of popcorn somehow wafting through the air. I sat backstage clutching my notes, stomach churning with nerves. Sarah peeked behind the curtain, gave me a thumbs up, and mouthed, "You've got this." Principal Garrett opened with the expected administrative speech about community values. Students responded with practiced polite indifference. Then Jamie took the stage, voice quavering as she described years of torment that teachers had dismissed. The audience fell silent, not the bored silence of tuned-out teenagers, but the attentive silence of recognition. Almost everyone there had either been Jamie, known Jamie, or been part of the problem for someone like her. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, caught sight of Lucas sitting slightly apart from his usual crowd, and felt my carefully prepared speech suddenly seem too rehearsed. A few weeks ago, I was the new girl with the thrift store clothes, the perfect target. I began, setting my notes aside. When Lucas Fletcher poured milk over my head, people didn't just watch. They recorded it. They shared it. They commented on it. I saw teachers shifting uncomfortably, perhaps worried about a public call-out. I don't want their pity or even apologies, though they're nice. What I want, what everyone deserves, is respect. Not because of who our parents are or what clothes we wear, but because dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you're born with. The auditorium was utterly silent now, hundreds of eyes fixed on me. Respect isn't a poster on the wall or an assembly. It's a choice we make every day in small moments. I used to think being invisible was safest. But invisibility isn't protection, it's surrender. And silence isn't peace, it's permission. I scanned the crowd, making eye contact with students who'd share their stories. Bullying doesn't just hurt the target. It hurts everyone. It makes us afraid to be ourselves, afraid to stand out, afraid to stand up. My gaze drifted toward Lucas, whose expression showed neither hostility nor mockery, just a complex mix of emotions. George Orwell wrote that, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Maybe in a culture of cruelty, simple kindness is its own kind of revolution. The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory, but genuine and spontaneous. As I returned to my seat, Lucas kept his eyes straight ahead, hands gripping his knees, knuckles white. The assembly ended, and students approached to say they liked my speech. A freshman whispered that she'd been dealing with similar issues and asked if we could talk. Even teachers offered genuine compliments rather than generic, "good jobs." As I gathered my things, Lucas approached, hovering anxiously. "That was a good speech," he mumbled, eyes darting everywhere but my face. "Look, I'm sorry," he finally said, words rushing out, "about the milk thing, and your journal, and everything." It wasn't eloquent or specific, but from a boy who'd probably never seriously apologized, it was something. "Thanks," I said simply, neither accepting nor rejecting. He nodded awkwardly. "My dad's making me volunteer at this homeless shelter. It's opening my eyes to how people struggle sometimes, how it's not always their fault." Then he walked away. It wasn't friendship or even reconciliation, just a tiny crack in the wall between bully and victim, powerful and powerless. That evening, Dad listened to my retelling with evident pride. When I recited parts of my speech, he got misty-eyed. "You sounded just like her right then," he said softly, meaning Mom. She always knew how to cut right to the heart of things without being cruel. "So, what happens now?" he asked as we cleaned up dinner. Another meal of his specialty, slightly overcooked pasta. Lucas isn't suddenly my friend. The administration isn't suddenly deeply invested in student well-being beyond avoiding lawsuits. Some kids will still be mean, and some teachers will still look away. I said, but that's not the whole story. Sarah and the literary magazine will still be there. Jamie and I are getting coffee to talk about starting a support group. Mrs. Peterson actually asked for student input on the anti-bullying curriculum and seemed to genuinely care. The world didn't change completely, I concluded, but parts of it did, and I definitely did. In my journal that night, I realized my entries had shifted from processing pain to recording growth. I still wore thrift store clothes, lived in a small rental in a town of mansions, and missed Mom every day. But I was no longer defined by what I lacked or how others saw me. The girl I'd been a month ago, terrified, isolated, desperate to be invisible, seemed like a different person. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but came through small moments. Standing up to Lucas, joining the magazine, sharing my poem, speaking at the assembly. As Hemingway wrote, "There are two ways to be strong, gradually then suddenly." Maybe that's how change always happens. Small choices creating a tipping point. Looking at the stars that had witnessed my journey, I felt peace mixed with anticipation. Westlake wasn't perfect, but it was no longer hostile territory. I had found my place, my voice, my people. I said my piece. I whispered to the night sky, imagining Mom somewhere among those distant lights. And this is just the beginning.